Who are you, master? He asked. Eh? What? Said Tom, sitting up, and his eyes glinting in the gloom. Don't you know my name yet? That's the only answer. Tell me, who are you, alone, yourself, and nameless? But you are young, and I am old. Eldest, that's what I am. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the barrel whites. When the elves passed westward, Tom was already here, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from the outside.
Welcome to the Wayward Wizards podcast. Today we're covering the end of Chapter 6 and reading Chapter 7 of the Fellowship of the Ring, a chapter entitled In the House of Tom Bombadil. My name is Logan.
And I am Zach.
So this week we're having kind of a Bombadil spectacular, as we teased last week. So we're mainly in Chapter 7, but I think we'll probably touch on a little bit of the end of Chapter 6 as well. Do you want to get us started on what we should be thinking about regarding Tom Bombadil? I mean, the main question is like, who is this guy? It's the main question of Chapter 7. Who
are you?
What are you? Why are you?
Well, he is, Logan.
He is, yes.
He's eldest, man. Don't worry about it too much.
Just don't think about it.
Just let it flow, man.
Tolkien didn't, so.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research because I went on a very self-righteous rant last episode that I had to cut out because it was very wrong, which just shows like how complicated this stuff is. The moment I start to think, oh yeah, I kind of know a little bit about like what's going on in Tolkien's Legendarium,
right? I
get humbled. So okay, who is Tom Bombadil? Last week we talked a lot about, do we like Tom Bombadil?
Yeah.
And I think we had kind of a mixed answer of, we kind of wish that he wasn't in the book, but also we're kind of glad that he's in the book at the same time.
Yeah, I like him as like a little mystery, but he just bugs me a little. You know, I'm like, come on, man. Like, what is this?
Who's this weird guy? Yeah. I mean, so, okay, people have been perplexed by Tom Bombadil since the book was published.
Mm-hmm.
It's not uncommon for people to be like, oh, okay. When Frodo asks Goldberry who Tom Bombadil is, she responds, he is, which is really similar to in the book of Exodus, the angel from the bush, like God speaking through the burning bush says, I am that I am. So that's a really similar construction. So Bombadil must be God.
Yeah.
And, someone wrote to Tolkien and basically was like, hey, I think I cracked it. Like Tom Bombadil's God, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, that's ridiculous. He is not nearly the same construction as I am that I am. And then he gets into this long explanation of like how that's not the case. So he's not God. Another like popular theory has always been like, okay, this is the like personification of Tolkien, like in the story. This is Tolkien, the author, kind of placing himself. No, like he is not into that kind of postmodern like storytelling device of like the author breaking the fourth wall. No, like he's not all about that. So it's not Tolkien. It's not God. People are like, okay, he's just nature personified.
Yeah, I can see where people get that idea.
I think that's like closer to the mark. Because he definitely is like in control of the natural world. Like he has a command over the natural world and an appreciation for the beauty of the natural world. And he has a body.
Yeah.
He's not just like an illusion. He has like a physical body. He's able to touch and manipulate things. He's kind of like clothed in flesh, if you will, incarnated.
And he's sort of seen everything. He's older than the trees, older than the hills, even.
And the first raindrop and the first acorn.
Yeah. So there's some like he's like a witness or something like that, like a witnessing being. Um,
So, like once we get through reading Lord of the Rings, if people want us to keep going, I think we'll probably read the Silmarillion together because
yeah,
you've never read the Silmarillion, right?
I've only like read like bits and pieces. I've never like sat down and read it cover to cover.
So, like, if you have read the Silmarillion cover to cover, congratulations. Um, the Ghost of Professor Tolkien will be sending you a personal pan pizza coupon.
Book it.
You've really achieved something if you read the Silmarillion. I've only just recently read the Silmarillion. I've read it a few times now. Done the read along, like listening to Professor Corey Olsen like breaking it down,
Yeah.
which is why I was like a little disappointed in myself for kind of like very overzealously mansplaining the nature of spiritual beings and Tolkien to you
Yeah.
last week. But
It was
uh,
embarrassing, guys. You're lucky that we're not including it.
oh man, maybe I should include it just to keep myself humble, and then we can get all the emails of people being like,
We can release it on the
actually,
we can release it on the Patreon someday. Listen to Zach
someday,
stumble over this.
someday, just the biggest swing followed
Yeah.
by the biggest miss.
Yeah.
But okay, so Bombadil most likely is a powerful, immortal, spiritual being
Mm-hmm.
who was present at the formation of the world, in this like musical creative experience with all the other powerful spiritual beings at the beginning of time before the material world was made. So I think it's the fact that Tom sings, I think is more than just a character quirk.
Mm.
I think it's kind of an echo of the song of creation that the spiritual beings sung to bring the world into being.
Yeah.
And like his songs have like a compelling nature to them. They like when people or things in the natural world hear Tom sing, they comply with
Yeah.
the command. And we kind of touched on this. I can't remember if it was last episode or the episode before, but like magic in Tolkien, it's less like spelled out and less fleshed out than like what you might expect in a kind of a more modern fantasy novel or
Right.
D&D game or video game, RPG, whatever. Magic kind of comes down to when you tell someone to do something, they do it.
Yeah. Authority of command or something like that.
Tolkien uses the phrase several times, the power of command.
Power of command.
Um,
Yeah, sure.
like when Boromir has his like ring-induced monologue later in the story, he says, "I would have the power of command." And we see this with like kingly characters in the story. People will just kind of drop whatever they're doing and say, "Lord, command me,"
Right.
or like, "Lord, tell me what to do and I'll do it." But like on a basic level, you're like extremely persuasive. Like you see like Wormtongue and
Mm-hmm.
Sauron have this like magic to their voice. Their voice casts a spell, which just means words or news,
Mm-hmm.
which is where we get the English word gospel, like what we have in the Bible, means good news.
Right.
God's spell, good news. And so Bombadil kind of has that like to an nth degree. He tells someone to do something and they do it immediately. It's very subtle in the book, but if he says like come over here, the hobbits come over here,
Yeah, he
you
tells
know,
Frodo and Sam to stop.
and they stop immediately.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it says as if they were enchanted because they were.
Right.
Um, he tells the old man Willow to let Merry and Pippin go, and it does. You know, a little bit later on, he, waves his hands above his head, and the rain doesn't get him wet.
Yeah.
He's able to tell not just beings, but also just the natural world to do something, and it does it
Right.
immediately. So Bombadil seems to be, he calls himself eldest. And he says, I was here before the acorns and the hills and the barrow whites and the first raindrop and all that. So I think it's pretty safe to say that he is one of these like powerful spiritual beings. In Tolkien's Legendarium, he's called a Maiar,
Which is the same as
which
like Gandalf and Saruman, right?
and the Balrog
And the Balrog, yeah. And Sauron.
and Sauron,
Right.
indeed. Yeah. I think that it's safe to say that Sauron with the ring is like way, way stronger than all those other characters.
Sauron is stronger. Yeah, I could see that.
He's like beefed up to an nth degree when he's in his full power.
Right.
But like, you know, like Gandalf and the Balrog are pretty evenly matched, even though like Gandalf is like very tired when they fight, and it kills him to defeat him, but he's kind of evenly matched.
Yeah.
With the Balrog, he has to die in order to defeat him, but he's pretty evenly matched. And yeah, so you have these spiritual beings called the Ainur. If your eyes start to glaze over while I'm talking about all these like names you've never heard before, just know you really don't have to know all this stuff to have it like be a meaningful, good story. But once you kind of start to grasp a little bit of just how complex and cohesive this like structure and all of Tolkien is, it's really incredible just how he never gets it mixed up. I got it mixed up last episode and had to cut it out, but Tolkien had like a really firm grasp on all this stuff.
I think it's interesting that he's done enough, he's done enough world building for himself that he can then introduce it into the story as like verisimilitude, like, but it's like tasteful. He's not self-indulgent. And there are books, in the same genre that you read where it feels like that world building, it gets in the way of the narrative because the author is like so impressed with their like this edifice that they've built,
Flofendor needed to get the Flippendingle before he could climb the mountains of Rivenquampen.
Right. And like that's not, if it doesn't serve the narrative, then it doesn't really belong. And Tolkien does a nice job of just suggesting, there's this suggestion that there's a background that's really deep. And if you want to get into it, you can, but if you just want to like let the narrative carry you along, it's totally fine. Although I would, in the same breath that I say that, I would also say that this Bombadil is incredibly self-indulgent. I don't know what he's doing. I don't think he knew what he was doing. I think,
why is it here? And like, I really hope that people who are like bigger Tolkien nerds than us aren't like throwing their phones out of their car window while they're hearing this or something.
My opinion is just my opinion. You know what I mean? Like if you love this, that's awesome. Please explain it to me. Because I would love to know.
I've grown to have an appreciation of Bombadil. I just remember having a really strong negative reaction to it when I was younger.
Yeah.
Of being like, especially after the movies came out.
Right.
And being like, what in the world? I think my first introduction to Lord of the Rings, because I was born in 1989 and the movies came out in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was like a little kid, I listened to the BBC radio drama.
Oh, interesting.
And NPR did a radio drama that was like in a wooden box set with cassette tapes.
Oh, that's cool.
And it was all acted out, and it was really cool, kind of like retro NPR stuff. But Bombadil wasn't in that. So when I first read this when I was like in 5th grade, after I knew the story pretty well, I just remember being like, what in the world? Like, talk about like eyes glazing over. But, talking about it being self-indulgent.
Maybe that's not fair. Self-indulgent is not fair, but it's, I really question, I just really question it. There are parts about it that I like the passage that we read to start the episode is very beautiful. I mean,
yes,
the prose is wonderful. And I love that this kind of being like lives in this world. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But I don't think it serves the story really.
No, But also, he was sitting on a very extensive draft of the Silmarillion, and
Yeah.
he had been told that the Silmarillion wasn't going to be like have a snowball's chance in hell of being
Right.
published.
Right. Right.
And so I think part of it is just him like wanting to slip in some of this
Yeah,
Silmarillion stuff.
that's how it feels. So there is sort of, I mean, it's not self-indulgent, but it's like his love for this is deep, and that does come through. It comes through as something
You know,
that Tolkien
all
really
the stuff
cared about.
about the elves going west, and the sun being new, like
Hmm.
on like the first men, and
Hmm.
uh the idea of the seas being bent, whereas before there was a straight path to the west. Um,
Oh, I see.
uh,
Yeah.
like all that is like the story of the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
And I think he thought that, this stuff wasn't ever going to be published, and he really wanted to put some of it in. And so Bombadil was kind of a way to do that. But Bombadil as a character is actually older than the published Hobbit.
Hmm.
He had published a poem called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil in 1934, which is
Wow.
so that's 3 years before The Hobbit is published. And it has a lot of the same characters as what we get in this chapter. It has Goldberry,
Hmm.
it has Old Man Willow, it has the Barrow Wights. There's a whole section in there about how annoying Tom Bombadil finds badgers, which also
Yeah,
pops up in this
he talks about
chapter.
that too. That's interesting. Hmm.
And like the what does he say, like the inscrutable actions of badgers or something like that. We'll come to it in a
Yeah,
minute.
something like that.
But yes, I mean, I think he loved this character. I think he thought that the Silmarillion was never going to be published, and so he needed to kind of slip in some of the depth that he felt like people were missing.
Hmm.
But I think he liked this character. He had it from 1934 already, kind of preformed. It was based off of a Dutch doll that his kids had, and they named him
Oh,
Tom Bombadil.
interesting.
I think that he wanted to get some of the Silmarillion material into the text in a subtle way.
Hmm.
And he's talked about how what makes stories like this great, if you are reading like Beowulf or something like that, there's a sense that there's like a framework underneath Beowulf
Yeah.
that isn't really explored, but you could ask them about it and they would have answers ready to go
Right.
about like, oh yeah, this person's father was this person's father was this person's father, and
Yeah.
they went off and did this interesting adventure, at this
Stuff that never
interesting
got
time, and
stuff that never got written down, but was part of like an oral tradition, or
or was like lost to time if it ever was written down.
yeah,
You
right,
know,
right.
that's something that always strikes me about reading, especially the Book of Genesis in the Bible.
Hmm.
Um, there's references to characters like Enoch,
Right.
where it's clear that
There's a whole
is
Enoch tradition out there.
there's a whole ocean of stories about this guy,
Yeah.
or reading just like weird things about the ages of heroes when there were giants,
Yeah.
and it's just kind of mentioned, and you just get like a little glimpse of what is clearly a rich like history. And Tolkien realized that that was like an effective device,
Yeah.
but it was only really effective if you actually had done the work of telling all these stories in like great detail, which he
Yeah.
did.
Right.
Like
Right.
there's no character that he mentions in this that doesn't have oceans of ink written about that character already by the time he's writing these drafts. And he said that it was kind of like being on a boat and looking out and seeing a distant shore, and knowing that if you steered your boat that direction and landed on the shore, that you could get off and you could walk among the mountains
Mm-hmm.
in that distant land, but also that you could just sail right past it. And that doesn't stop the fact that the land is there. But being able to glimpse it from the boat like we are here, adds depth to the story. It gives it like I think, what's the word you used earlier? Verisimilitude.
Verisimilitude. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives it like a sense of historicity, or that it's an actual world that's been lived in.
Right.
Um, but yeah, like if we get to read the Silmarillion together, all this stuff is in there in great detail. That's just kind of mentioned very quickly here.
Yeah.
But there was a time in a history before this particular story, and I think that's what Tom really represents, that there are things in the world that are so old and ancient, and that they aren't bothered with the kind of passing conflicts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why he seems to have nothing, like the ring doesn't seem to affect him at all.
It's like a
He's
joke.
not tempted by it.
It's like a joke to
Yeah.
him. Yeah.
Yeah. He even calls it like a word that's used kind of often is capering.
Yeah.
Like he's a capering, that he's called like a juggler, or like someone who's like, doesn't take it seriously.
Yeah. He almost treats it the way a street magician would treat, your watch or whatever.
Yeah, it's like you look at the thing he hands you back with suspicion to make sure he hasn't slipped in his pocket.
He calls it the precious ring, and it's sort of a joke. It's like, oh yeah, this precious thing,
Yeah,
he just doesn't take any of it seriously,
because it's not precious to him at all. Yeah, you're so right.
No,
That's an ironic.
It's nothing to him. He doesn't seem to be interested in gold and jewels at all.
No.
The landscape metaphor is interesting because it does sort of, to me, it feels like there is a geography or something introduced in this chapter that doesn't exactly belong. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't resemble the surrounding countryside or something like that. There's this area in northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, and Wisconsin called the Driftless area, which was never affected by glacial like geography. Like it just never got covered over by glaciers. And you drive into it and you're like, oh, like what happened? I just drove out of all this farmland into this area that's like, it really feels ancient, especially if you know what you're dealing with. That's what this feels like. Is driving into an area that is just geographically ancient, different, out of the ordinary. Certainly.
Yeah, it's like a weird like it's an old, they call it the old forest. I almost said it's an old forest. Yeah.
It's like a remnant of this bigger forest, right? Yeah. Which England is full of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And like you get a sense like before human beings came and settled this area, everything was this unbroken forest from like coast to coast. And there are these places that have been like saved from those expansion of human settlements,
right?
But the forest is like resentful of the human beings who like the usurpers is what Bombadil calls them, and he says like hacking and slashing and gnawing and biting and burning. And
I'd like to read really quick here. It's 127 in my edition. Tom's words laid bare the hearts of trees and their thoughts, which were often dark and strange and filled with a hatred of things that go free upon the earth, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning, destroyers and usurpers. It was not called the old forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. The countless years had filled them with pride and rooted wisdom and with malice. Wow.
And it says starts, they're usurpers.
Yeah, we get that in the most sort of distilled in The Great Willow.
Later called Old Man Willow.
Old Man Willow, yeah. It's his heart was rotten, but his strength was green. That's a great phrase.
Yeah, and I think it's that he he talks about his gray, thirsty spirit. Like, and he basically calls him like a general. He's like a force because he's oldest. He is kind of like in control, in command of the rest of the forest. And I had thought that the paths that were mentioned in chapter 6 that they were following were made by Tom Bombadil. And I think that's definitely like a possibility. It's not really ever
Oh,
explicitly
interesting.
said, but it seems like what he's talking about here, it's like, oh, Old Man Willow is like drawing prey into the heart of the forest.
Yeah.
And he's using his minions, these younger trees, to kind of like push people indelibly towards the Withywindle.
Right.
Um, Almost like a Venus flytrap. Like
Yeah.
you attract your prey and then you close your tendrils around it.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I think it might be a little bit of both, where it's like Tom is making paths through the forest, but also the Old Man Willow, this like kind of like, rotten hearted, resentful, angry, malicious tree with memory longer than we could ever fathom, and with resentments deeper than we could ever imagine, is like getting its revenge by
Yeah.
drawing these flies like into the old forest.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I didn't think I think I always thought about the paths as somehow constructed by the trees.
Hmm.
But I think it makes sense that, Tom is making paths also. And the things aren't he's not at odds with nature, you know?
No.
I guess because he's sort of, predates nature. He's like seen it come up there, but he's not at odds, but he's also, I don't know. I almost wonder if this little remnant of the forest, even though it has, parts about it that are kind of scary, if the remnant of the forest doesn't exist because Tom sort of exists there too,
Yeah.
or something, and so it's kind
Like
of
he
a lot.
sustains it.
He
He
sustains
sustains it.
it, but he doesn't sustain it. It says that he's master, but he's not master over anything. Everything has it.
He's not an owner. Like he doesn't own the woods or the things that live in the woods, but he is master of them. Like he's the caretaker.
Right. So he may sustain that area, but he doesn't sustain it with any kind of like coercion or anything. He doesn't have a
Right.
plan.
Right.
It just exists on its own. It has its own kind of end that he doesn't
Yeah.
interrupt. And so he'll go to, to Old Man Willow and tell him like, don't eat these hobbits. But he's not
Yeah.
going to say like act better, or don't be so much yourself, because that's what Old Man Willow has grown to be.
Well, that's a really interesting point. It's
Because
not like he's not going to chop down Old Man Willow.
yeah, couldn't he chop him down, or couldn't he say like stop being so much the way you are? And he doesn't,
Yeah. No.
because I think it's Goldberry who says everything owns itself. Tom Bombadil doesn't own it. He's master. He has
Yeah.
some authority, but he doesn't like, I can't quite make the connection, but there's something there, about, it sort of reveals something about Tom, that's sort of interesting, I think.
I think that's worth reading, that selection. I'm gonna go back to just kind of like continuing the story just so people can follow along. Frodo, in a panic, calls out for help, and Tom Bombadil shows up and commands Old Man Willow to release the other two hobbits. And then he says essentially like, all right, follow me. Goldberry's waiting, and he kind of runs off into the forest, and they kind of follow along kind of dumbly.
Mm-hmm.
They're exhausted, and they're, much worse for the wear. They've just survived this terrible thing. And then they arrive at this mysterious house in the middle of the forest where, the grass is mowed, and there's sort of an order in the chaos of the forest. It's a domestication. It's a domicile. It's a cabin in the woods, a house in the
Yeah.
woods, but it also is very much like in concert with nature in a way that is pretty foreign to the way that we think of houses now. It's not, it's within nature, but there's still an order to it. But they see Goldberry, who, we talk about what is Tom, like what the F is Goldberry?
Yeah. Goldberry is even more magical than Tom.
The
So,
river daughter, they call her.
the daughter of the river daughter. At one point, she has a candle behind her hand, and the light shines through it like a shell.
Uh,
So her body is like made of something different than normal flesh.
and
Um,
her feet, she's like clad in like in white, but it says that her shoes look like they're made of fish mail,
yeah,
like fish scales.
I sort of thought of a mermaid,
Yeah, and I think it's like she's the daughter of the river, which is, it's a common, uh if we had someone who's a scholar of like, British literature, maybe they could tell us more about the history of the river daughter. But
yeah.
in the original 1934 poem, she kind of like tricks Tom Bombadil into coming into the river with her. She kind of lures him in and ensnares him, and he's able to command her to let him go. But then he comes back later and asks her to marry him. Like there's like something like, oh, like I've met like essentially my equal out here.
Yeah, that's really
Um,
sweet.
she was able to ensnare me. I was enthralled by her.
It's like if Odysseus went back and married one of the sirens.
Yeah, exactly.
um,
Yeah, so she
yeah,
has kind of this siren quality to her. Yeah, where she's kind of mischievous and
when she
uh,
when she moves around, or when she speaks or sings, they hear like water flowing. It's like tinkle
yeah,
of water, like falling over
yeah,
rocks and things like that.
yeah,
So she's really in some way less human than Tom, but
yeah.
Tom is not human either, and so,
No, no.
um, and their relationship, this is like the horniest Lord of the Rings gets, I think,
Oh,
actually.
oh, the
Um,
sexual tension. Oh, yeah, I know.
he's like gathering lilies for her. He only does that, occasionally. Like I'm
Oh,
gonna,
we know what that means.
I need to gather some lilies later with Elizabeth, if you know what I mean. And
If you know what I mean. Yeah, it's that day of the
and
week.
it's that day of the week. We got it on the schedule.
It's lily gathering time.
Yeah, lily gathering. But it is a sort of sexy thing. There's something about their relationship. They have this like dance, even when they like are clearing the table. It's like beautiful the way they clear the table.
Well, you said that this is the horniest that Lord of the Rings gets. I think you're right, but I think the horniest Lord of the Rings gets is Gimli, like fawning over Galadriel, being like, "Can I have a
Well,
lock of your hair?"
yeah, that's true.
Holy mackerel,
Yeah,
Gimli! Like,
he really has one for Galadriel, that's for sure.
like fighting people if they said that she's not the most beautiful woman in the world. It's like, all
Yeah,
right, yeah, he's been away from home for a while. He's not been around those hairy little dwarf women.
that's right. They get down.
So Goldberry, Frodo says essentially like, "Fair lady, tell me if my asking does not seem foolish. Who is Tom Bombadil?"
Mm.
And she responds, "He is." Frodo looked at her questioningly, and she says, "He is as you have seen him. He is the master of the wood, water, and hill." And so Frodo kind of logically asks, then all the strange land belongs to him, which is a very like, human way of thinking of the land, like the land being something that you can own.
Yeah.
But she says, "No, indeed." And it says her smile fades. So she gets really serious. She says, "That would indeed be a burden. The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under the light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master." So I think like, comparing Bombadil to a spiritual being of similar stature, Sauron, or even Saruman, the idea is that they want to be powers, which is a word that comes up a lot, capital P powers. They want to make themselves a power. They want to be like the Valar. They want to be like gods.
Right.
And the way that they do that is by asserting dominion over the beings in their land, but also the natural world. They chop down the forests and they burn and they hack and they slash. And like the wheels of industry are how they enslave and control the land, which they see as something that they own, but also the human beings who they turn to slaves. They enthrall them. They make them thralls, which means a slave.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of wrap up all this talk, I guess we could just say that Tom and Goldberry represent these sort of like ageless spiritual beings who have existed in this place far longer than any conflict among human beings, far longer even than the elves. They were there before even the Dark Lord came. And I think it's important to note here that he's not talking about Sauron when he mentions the Dark Lord. He's talking about Morgoth, who is Sauron's boss. Morgoth is like the fallen angel. He's Lucifer. He's Satan in Tolkien's Legendarium. He's way, way more powerful than Sauron. They sort of represent the timelessness, I think, of good. That it's something I think you mentioned a few episodes back that I think bears repeating. You said, this may have been like in episode 2. You said, if Frodo doesn't choose to take up the ring, that someone else will take up the ring, and the ring will eventually end up being thrown into the cracks of doom and being destroyed. Even if it's not, soon, even if it takes a couple thousand more years, that kind of the capital G good won't let evil endure for that period of time. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what these characters represent, which is that for them, even this very important thing is a really fleeting moment. There's a scene that I haven't mentioned yet, but it's probably my favorite scene in the entire book, which is in The Return of the King. Sam and Frodo are sort of on their final death march to Mount Doom, and they're exhausted and they're out in the open. I think there's very little hope that they're going to make it there to destroy the ring alive without being captured, much less get back home once they throw the ring in the fire. But they're so tired that they can't even like bring themselves to hide properly. They just kind of lay down on the ground, and Sam looks up into the sky, and the smokes of Mount Doom part for a moment, and he sees a star in the sky.
Yeah.
And he realizes that even if the Dark Lord were to get the ring and succeed and enslave the entire world, that there's nothing that he could do to disrupt that perfect, beautiful thing, that there was light and high beauty that no power or evil on earth could touch.
The clouds are temporary, right?
Yeah.
In that moment, and that parting sort of shows Sam the like truth, which is that the eternal is there. It's interesting that Bombadil has some insight into he's heard the beginning, middle, and end of the story at the Song of Creation.
He was there when the story of all of creation was written.
Right, and so he's unconcerned, right, because he has this deep. It goes beyond knowledge. It's like a trust, or there's like something ontological about Tom, like which means it's like part of his being, right? Like his being is rooted in the fact that the goodness of creation flows out of Eru Iluvatar, God, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking like Gandalf is a similar kind of being, right? Or the same kind of being as Tom. Yeah. But he's very worried about defeating Sauron. That's his whole goal.
Yeah.
However, Gandalf is sent with that charge.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Gandalf has a mission that he has to fulfill. Tom doesn't have a mission.
Yeah.
He wasn't sent with a mission.
No.
And so Tom just sort of dances through life because that's what he was sent to do.
Yeah. He's just this joyful, exuberant, capering, singing being.
And so because he doesn't have a mission, he doesn't need to, like, he just exists. It's like a manifestation of like mindfulness or something. Like he just
Yeah.
exists in the moment. You know, he exists in that present moment. He's fully present to his own joy and the joy of the world and the beauty of nature, and and so I think that's where his kind of unconcernedness comes from. And
Right.
Gandalf keeps going in his mission because he's been charged and because I think he knows that it's worthwhile.
Yeah.
But his being is really different because he's really meant to oppose the forces of, evil in the world. And so
Yeah.
he has a really different kind of existential stake or whatever, even though he's a
Yeah.
similar or the same kind of being.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, anyway, worth drawing the comparison there because the book actually draws the comparison too. Like Gandalf is so concerned about the ring. How come, how come Bombadil isn't? And I think that's why, because he just isn't charged to care. He's like, I don't, it's fine. Like the ring is what it is. But
Whenever Tom tells him to give him the precious ring, Frodo complies, which in itself is kind of a strange thing. Like the ring already has got a hold on Frodo. Like in the Shadow of the Past, he's not able to cast it into the small fire in his hobbit hole, but he just gives it up willingly to Tom. After when he has it handed back to him, it says, he was perhaps a trifle annoyed with Tom for seeming to make so light of what even Gandalf thought so perilously important. And that's when he puts the ring on. Like he puts it on, and he is like, you think this is just a trifle? Let me show you what this thing can do. And he puts it on, but Tom can still see him.
yeah,
And he's like, hey,
where you going?
guess what?
Staying here.
Yeah, and there's this sense that like when a mortal puts on the ring, that they're kind of slipping into this spiritual realm.
Yeah, Wraith World or whatever.
There's this like sort of like in between place that if you put it on, where you are able to exist in this spiritual realm where these great beings exist. And I think Tom just kind of lives there all the time.
Oh, interesting.
That's where Tom is, because he is a great spiritual being. I mean, he's incarnated, but sort of like other beings who we're going to meet in a minute, namely Glorfindel, the very powerful, very old elf. He could see Frodo if he had the ring on.
Mm-hmm.
Sauron could certainly see Frodo if he had the ring on.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it is like he's like more visible if he has the ring on.
Yeah, like highlights him.
So I think that kind of shows a little bit about the nature of who Tom is. Tom and Goldberry create this safe haven for the hobbits in the forest, and they tend to their needs. They bathe them, they like tell them to take out their tangles, scrub under your fingernails, whatever, and then they feed them like a really great meal, and then they go to sleep. And this scene reminds me a whole lot of the house of Beorn in The Hobbit.
Yeah. There's an interesting parallel there.
Because Beorn is also kind of this like powerful, mysterious being that you don't quite understand what the nature of his power is. And he also seems to have like a command of nature, like the animals wait at his table and he's able to control bees and all these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And of course he's able to turn into a bear, which a skin changer. I mean, that's no small feat. But there's this scene where Bilbo wakes up in the middle of the night and hears Beorn kind of creeping outside, and he's been warned, don't go outside because it's perilous out there. And there's a really similar scene here where Frodo, Merry, and Pippin all have these kind of fretful dreams, and then they're kind of lulled back to sleep. Heed no nightly noises. Do not be afraid. And they're kind of like lulled back to sleep with the spell of Goldberry's voice. And yeah, all three of them have really interesting dreams, Sam does not. It says that Sam just slept like a log, which I think is so funny. Like Sam was untroubled. If logs can be untroubled or whatever it says.
I want to read that. As far as he could remember, Sam slept through the night in deep content, if logs are contented. That's so good.
Yeah, that's so good. So good. Yeah, we ride for Sam, man. Sam is, uncomplicated at this point in the story, at least. But you want to talk about Frodo's dream?
Yeah, Frodo's dream. Pretty much every time he falls asleep, he has a dream. It seems like. And we're presented with kind of a frightening scene. We just get it in like vignettes, as dreams go. It says that he saw a young moon rising.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a sliver of a moon. Under its thin light, there loomed before him a black wall of rock pierced by a dark arch, like a great gate. And then he's lifted up. He goes over a rock wall, kind of like a circle of hills. There's a plain. There's a mist on the plain. There's a pinnacle of stone like a vast tower, but not made by hands. And on its top stood the figure of a man. The moon, as it rose, seemed to hang for a moment above his head and glistened in his white hair as the wind stirred it. So I think we're thinking about Gandalf here, even without the upcoming chapter, in Rivendell. Right away, I think you think of Gandalf. Although we don't perhaps know that, it has something to do with Saruman and it's probably Orthanc and all the rest, but it's another one of those visions that Frodo's having of something going on. And then we hear that the figure lifted his arms and a light flashed away from the staff that he wielded. I think we think about Gandalf again there. A mighty eagle swept down and bore him away. Anyone who had read The Hobbit at this point would have known about eagles and their kind of capacity to take people out of danger. So
and it seems like he's probably being given a vision of where Gandalf is.
Right.
And either this is Gandalf kind of like reaching out sort of telepathically to Frodo, letting him know where he is, because he's afraid that Frodo's being pursued and that he hasn't properly warned him.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is the Valar letting Frodo know, like, hey, this is where Gandalf is. But it's not completely obvious to Frodo. Like, he doesn't say like, oh, hey, this is Gandalf.
There he is.
Yeah.
Like,
oh, that's why he's being imprisoned by the other powerful wizard who we've only had mentioned in the second chapter of the book. And we won't meet again until we see him after he's been imprisoned by Treebeard, which, like, weird way of telling the story, Tolkien, whatever. We won't get into that. Like, we're just going to hear about him in dialogue at the Council of Elrond.
Right.
And just kind of be told retrospectively what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's interesting. It says, the figure lifted his arms and a light flashed from the staff that he wielded. A mighty eagle swept down and bore him away. And then it says, the voices wailed and the wolves yammered. There was a noise like a strong wind blowing, and on it was borne the sound of hooves galloping, galloping, galloping from the east.
Galloping, galloping, galloping is like, really highlights what a great word that is for the sound a horse makes when it runs. Galloping,
yeah, because it doesn't just do it once.
That's exactly
galloping.
That's exactly what a horse sounds like when it runs. I love that. Such a great. I mean, English is is what it is. It's a messy language, but the parts of it are so beautiful.
Yeah, we've said it a couple times, but Tolkien really writes for the ear, not for the eye. I think he had like a really unique ability to recognize like the aesthetic beauty of the spoken word. Another like thing that he does is alliteration. He does a lot, but so he'll put words that have a similar beginning together, which is like a very different way of thinking of rhyme, but it is very lyrical. But, he loves the word glitter and he loves the word gloom.
Yeah.
and he loves the word doom, and he
Mhm.
loves the word dwemer.
Yeah.
You know, he has like all these words that you can just tell he really loves because he uses them over and over and over again. You know, one interesting thing that I kind of had written down is one question that I always had, especially watching the movies, but um, you know, reading the books as well, is how Gandalf still has his staff and his sword after his imprisonment at Orthanc.
Yeah, I wonder if Saruman can't take them,
It seems that way.
or he can't take them without,
Killing him.
um, well, without killing him, but without, you know, casting Gandalf out of the like council or something, or
Yeah,
which maybe he's not empowered to do or doesn't
he
want to
doesn't have the
do.
authority.
He, maybe still thinks Gandalf can be used or something. That's I never thought about that. Like he just doesn't have the power to take that from Gandalf.
Yeah, it
Um,
says a light flashed from the staff that he wielded. A mighty eagle swept down and bore him away. So that implies that he kind of had his staff up on top of the pinnacle of Orthanc.
yeah, I love that. That's so cool. Um, it also, I mean, does he like signal the eagles? Somehow, is the Flash sort of?
What we learn later during the Council of Elrond, once again, this is all told retrospectively, is that he met Radagast the Brown, and he told Radagast to let the Eagles know to look out for Black Riders,
Yeah, right.
because Radagast, like, you know, was sent by Sauron to find Gandalf,
Hmm.
but Radagast was not like in on this at all. But he tells Gandalf he's being summoned to Orthanc, right? And as he's leaving, Gandalf says to Radagast, like, "Hey, let the Eagles know, like, to like be on the lookout for Nazgul or whatever." And so Sauron doesn't know that Gandalf has done this because Radagast is not in on this plot. And so the Eagles are just flying around, and they happen to see Gandalf like on top of the pinnacle, and Gandalf's like, "Hey, you know, can I hitch a ride out of
Yeah.
here?"
Ding.
Um, yeah, yeah. I guess like, "Hey,
Hey
here's my
guys, it's
here's my
me.
lighter."
Right.
Yeah, there's no whispering to moths, unfortunately.
That's a nice
A Peter
addition.
Jackson
I like that a
creation.
lot. Yeah, I like that a lot actually, and the idea you would choose a moth to like. I mean, how fast can a moth fly? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Not fast. But
not fast at all.
it's very Gandalf to like whisper to a moth is
And the way he catches him without crushing
without
him, like he
hurting
kind of,
him. That's
and he's,
beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah, there's some
Uh,
sweet things in those movies, man.
but yeah, that does answer, and I never noticed it until this reading. It does answer a question that I've had for probably 20 years, which is, you know, how does Gandalf still have his staff and his sword
Yeah,
after he hitches the ride from the eagle? It seems like it was never taken away from him.
yeah. I don't think Saruman can take it. Mm-mm.
Yeah, interesting.
Not without killing him. Yeah, we also get dreams from Pippin and Merry, but I think those mostly function to kind of show the power that they're under of Goldberry's words to them, and to show that there's still something threatening out there. They're still feeling some fear. Pippin and Merry went through this horrible experience of being like almost eaten by the tree.
Yeah.
And so I think
They have like dream PTSD. They're having flashbacks.
absolutely terrible. And like Sam is like just so hard headed and practical that he doesn't even have a dream. At least at this point, he's he just sleeps like a log. I love that. And I don't know how much do we want to get into. I mean, they eat breakfast. There's some hobbitry. Goldberry's washing day comes around. She obviously has some connection to the water and the way that the weather works in this area. It maybe bears mentioning that Tom is constantly telling us that he doesn't control the weather,
Yeah,
although it seems like he's always saying, he tells Old Man Willow that he'll blow up a wind and take his leaves
yeah.
away. And you talked about how
Yeah, good point.
he can kind of command the rain not to get him wet. And
Yeah, he kind of like waves his hands over his head, and that's like an umbrella.
yeah, and I don't know if Bombadil is just sort of like downplaying his like abilities or something like that. But 'cause he says like, well, nothing on two legs commands the weather. It's like, well, except for me sometimes. you know?
Except for me sometimes, and maybe Goldberry because it's her washing day. Is she
Yeah,
making it rain?
Maybe Goldberry too, but like maybe Goldberry doesn't exactly walk around on two legs. Is it just an illusion? You know what I mean? Like
Ooh,
something about her is really weird, right? And the I think I said earlier that the like light sort of shines through her.
yeah.
She's like this elemental. She's an element. That's how I think of her.
And there's definitely some like clearly he's writing this part of the story before he's even like conceived of the idea of Galadriel. Like
Yeah,
Galadriel is a much later construction.
they relate to her with the same kind of awe as Galadriel too.
In like the whole like holding the candle and the light shining, that's very, very similar to the way that the light shines through her ring
Right.
during the Mirror of Galadriel scene. That it looks like a living light comes from her hand.
I can't remember if I mentioned this in the last episode or not, but they give some credence to my buddy Harlan, who says like Tolkien just didn't know what he was doing at this point,
He didn't.
and so
All respect to the professor. He was still searching for the story. Now I think that's part of why this makes it in, is just because he was like, oh well, I already have this Bombadil guy. Let me just kind of riff on him for a little bit.
He knew he had good ideas, right?
Yeah.
And this idea of Goldberry and some of her, the way that she appears and her powers and her beauty and this sort of ethereal quality that she has shows up again when he did know what he was doing. And so he's like, well, let's just repeat it. It's a good idea. Tolkien clearly has this real, almost worshipful relationship to women. In a way,
yeah, very romantic, very chivalric love.
Women are like, you like can't even really touch a woman without sort of like, screwing it up or something. Like a man like can't even, relate to a woman in a way that doesn't upset like the beauty of her whatever. I mean, I have that.
It's very chivalric. It's very like Arthurian,
and I get it.
I mean,
I totally get it.
I do too. Yeah, women are
lay,
awesome and mysterious and
I lay down
beautiful.
I lay down in bed with my wife and I'm like, I can't believe I get to sleep next to a woman every night. It's like magic, I'm just like, she just like lets me get into bed with her. Like, I'm like, what? Why?
Well, I imagine it's kind of like, Tolkien just lives in this very male world,
Absolutely.
And like he wouldn't have female friends. Like,
no.
I think you can imagine him, spending a lot of time away from home. Like all of his work relationships are male. All of his deep friendships are male. Yeah, I think that's just kind of the world that Tolkien lives in. But there really are so many parallels between Goldberry and Galadriel. I mean, they're both these like kind of like very ancient, very powerful spiritual beings. They both have golden hair.
Right.
They're both wearing white. They both kind of create this like house of refuge for them in the midst of a wood after an incredible danger. Yeah, so I think there's lots of parallels between Goldberry and Galadriel. She's almost like kind of like a proto Galadriel character before he really knew where the story was going. I wanted to mention like the stories that Tom tells, like the kind of the history lesson that the hobbits are given. He talks about like sort of like what makes the Barrow Downs. So this is like in the first age. So right now we're in the third age.
The stories he's telling are in the first age, right?
Exactly. So the current action with the characters Merry, Pippin, Sam, Frodo, like in the House of Tom Bombadil, this is the third age. But Tom has been here since before the sun and the moon. All right. So he's been around for a long time. He's been around since it was like dark under the stars and there was no fear in the darkness. So before the sun and the moon were even made, he's been in this area. And he talks about the men in the first age with their red swords, which I guess is like kind of like an allusion to the Bronze Age. Like
sure.
a time that's like so ancient as before they even had steel.
Sure. Interesting.
and that they were the kings of little kingdoms, and they fought together under the young sun, which shone like fire on the red metal of their new and greedy swords. So this is like, similar to, Greeks and Romans reading the Odyssey or something, or reading the Iliad. This is a story about ancient people before this time, and they fight each other, and they have these little kingdoms, and they die, and they're shut up in these stone tombs. But then a shadow comes later and wakes them up, and that is Sauron. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that he mentions that he was there before the first raindrop, before the first acorn. He was there before the elves moved west, which is a very complicated story that we'll get to when we read the Silmarillion. But the elves are born on Middle Earth, and then after some time, the Valar invite them to come to Valinor in the west.
Mm-hmm.
And a good chunk of them go, and this is like Galadriel's people, the Noldor, the wise. They travel over to Valinor for a period of time, and then they make their way back to Middle Earth, because Morgoth steals the Silmarils.
Right.
But he says, Tom was here already before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from the outside. With a capital O and a capital D and a capital L, Dark Lord from the outside. Mm-hmm. This is referencing the cataclysm that happens after Numenor is destroyed. And before that,
Numenor is like where Aragorn's people are from.
Yes.
Originally. They're like superhumans.
Yeah, they're like extra tall, extra long-lived.
Right.
They have great technology. They're the people who build Minas Tirith. They're the people who build Orthanc.
And so good
they
looking.
Yeah, they're the people of Westerness is what it's called. And this is essentially Tolkien's Atlantis myth.
Yeah, Atlantis, right.
And so they're like the Atlanteans. They have crazy technology that's lost to time. They are superhuman in basically every way, extra long-lived. But when they board ships and go to war against the Valar, trying to get immortal life, because Sauron has been in their kingdom fucking things up,
telling them that they should be immortal.
And that they're being like withheld immortality that the elves have been given,
even though mortality is like a gift, actually.
Tolkien calls it the gift of man.
So we'll get into that someday. We'll talk more about that. But they go.
I can hear people starting to snore.
They rebel against God, and God says, no more of this nonsense.
Well, they march on the Valar, and the Valar are like, oh, like this is above our pay grade. And so the king of the Valar, Manwë, he calls up to Eru and is basically like, hey, I'm not sure what to do. And so God destroys Numenor, very like, biblical flood myth.
Yeah.
And he traps the people, the Numenorians who took ship to invade Valinor. He traps them under the ground until the end of time, when they'll be called back to fight Morgoth in kind of the last battle of good and evil.
Interesting.
Which has definite like echoes to the Oathbreakers that Aragorn,
the ghosts,
the undead army.
I guess
we can call them ghosts.
They're ghostly.
They're ghosts.
I don't know.
Yeah, they're ghost adjacent. But so I mean, when that happens, during that time, the earth was flat, and there was an ocean between Middle Earth and Valinor, and in between, like almost exactly in between, was the island of Numenor. Mm-hmm. But when Numenor was destroyed, God made the earth round, And so it's kind of like a retcon explanation for why the Earth is round. When, like, for most of the stories of human history, the world is conceived of as flat. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an explanation for why the Earth is round. And then Valinor is like no longer part of the same like Earth that Middle Earth is. And you're only able to get there through this like magical road that only the elves have access to.
Yeah, you have to have a ship or whatever, or somebody who can keep going straight.
Yeah, even though the Earth is
instead of
round
over the bent ocean, you just like kind of like keep on that plane.
Yeah, it's like a spaceship essentially.
Yeah,
pretty sick stuff. And nobody who is reading this in 1954 would have any idea what he is talking about, because the Silmarillion won't come out for like another 25 years.
Yeah. Wild. That's so wild. But it does add, I mean, when Tom Bombadil says something like that, but before the sea was bent, you're like, what? And that's the piece that makes it feel like a magical book. I think the book, it benefits from those little touches for sure.
It kind of reminds me of like in episode 4 of Star Wars.
Yeah.
There's a scene where Obi-Wan Kenobi is kind of like filling in Luke on like, the history that he didn't really have like a lot of knowledge of about his father and everything else.
He says, he fought in the Clone Wars, and you're like, what's the Clone Wars?
And they don't explain what the Clone Wars is, and you're like, kind of like, okay, so there's like clones in this universe, and there was a war with clones, and like I think the difference between that and this is that, when we actually get the Clone Wars in episode 2, it's a little bit of a letdown, and you're kind of like, oh
yeah, just a little.
Like yeah, no kidding. I mean, kind of famously, the prequels were a huge dud.
Totally sucks.
But I think that part of the reason why that failed was it was kind of better when we didn't know.
Yeah.
And we had a sense that there was this like deep historical like legend undergirding it all.
Yeah.
The difference being that like for Tolkien, he had been building it for 35 years by the time he wrote it down here.
Yeah, George Lucas just said he did, but actually never did any of that work.
And it's pretty obvious, and I think that's
totally
why
obvious.
People love to kind of hate on the Silmarillion, but I think it's hard to argue that it's not like a work of pure genius.
Yeah.
And I was really slow to come to the Silmarillion because it was like kind of like reading the Bible, only with more religion.
It's also, that's funny. It's also I think the reason it works is because it is a pure creative act.
Yeah.
Yes, Tolkien wanted people to read these stories and wanted, did seek to get the Silmarillion published. But the act of creation itself was the impetus was not to become a famous author. He had a job,
Yeah.
And a vocation, and it comes out of that vocation rather than the end being, a big audience or whatever.
Yeah. If he had like commercial success from Lord of the Rings and then was like, okay, now I got to go write retrospectively all the stories of the Silmarillion, it wouldn't have the same. You keep using this really like fancy word, verisimilitude. How do you pronounce that?
I better look it up so I don't embarrass
verisimilitude. Is that verisimilitude?
Verisimilitude. I don't even know how.
Logan and I both went to very famous institutions of higher education.
Vanderbilt University.
Yeah, so we definitely we're the best at Googling how to pronounce words that we
right. Right, it says verisimilitude. Verisimilitude. Yeah. The quality.
Yeah, exactly like we said. Verisimilitude. Yeah,
exactly. The quality of appearing to be true or real. A synonym would be truth, but we don't use it as the same as truth. Truth would be something that is real. Verisimilitude is something, to me, when I think about
the perception of depth,
the perception of truth, that this is a true story that happened. And we really get that I mean, that's true in Star Wars in Episode 4. You know, as you say, there is that appearance of verisimilitude and this kind of lived-in quality. But it's an accident because like Star Wars, the magic of Star Wars is an accident of all the people who came together to make this thing.
Yeah.
And the Lord of the Rings is not an accident. It's the expression of one man's passion for a
Obsession.
world, yeah, a world which he sort of willed into existence.
And it was deeply, deeply theological for him. Like he and
Yeah,
C.S. Lewis both talked about themselves as sub creators, that by like wanting that God was a creator. And so in wanting to imitate the God that they love, they themselves had to be creators. And so they called themselves sub creators. So they took, like, I think Tolkien took it far more seriously than Lewis. There's this book behind me that just came out, which is a book that I kind of wish hadn't been published, because it kind of shows like the depths of like madness that Tolkien went to in creating this world.
mm-hmm.
It's called The Nature of Middle Earth, edited by Carl F. Hostetter. And it's one of the only Tolkien books that has not been put to an audiobook. And it is so obvious why, because like a huge portion of it is just math. Like it is like Tolkien sitting down and doing arithmetic about, all right, this is how often elves reproduce. And so given
What?
this span of time and this many elves that are there in the beginning, you know, the powers of like multiplication and exponential growth, this is how many elves there should be by the time Lord of the Rings starts. And so he's like obsessively going over like, okay, this is how many elves there has to be at this point in the story. And if they like on this schedule, then they will have this many offspring. And then the next generation of elves will be, and it's just like it's almost too much. And I feel like that's where, you know, like you talk about the lived in quality of the world. He was occupying this world in his head a significant portion of his waking life. And it 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 feels so true because for him it was true. And it had to be cohesive, and it had to follow rules that were consistent. And he was obsessive. I mean, you were talking about the stage of the moon
Yeah.
that he mentions that Gandalf is standing under Orthanc. I guarantee you, if we were to look at a timeline of events like chronologically, that stage of the moon would match,
Yeah, of
because
course.
he,
Right.
he was very, like, he called it a new moon, you know, it has like a dim light. He obsessively looked at the stage of the moon of the calendar, and he made sure that when he describes the moon, that it matches the way that it would happen in the real world on the real calendar date that he describes these things happening as the story moves forward. And I feel like that's where Star Wars, like, I think you and I both love Star Wars and have loved Star Wars for a
Yeah,
long
of
time.
course. Yeah.
Um, I think that where it falls short compared to this, and where like I have no doubt that in 200 years people are still going to be talking about Lord of the Rings. I don't know if that's the case for Star Wars, maybe, but like
Yeah. Yeah,
like
maybe. I mean,
it's like a sleight of hand though. Like when he says the Clone Wars, that's like it's a it's a compelling name, but he clearly doesn't have it worked out to the level that Tolkien has it worked out. Like George
no.
Lucas doesn't have like a 400-page book full of like like, you know, Jedi math that
Yeah.
will be published someday. That just
And
doesn't
he will,
exist.
like I said, George Lucas will say that he did, but it's clearly not true. It's like
Yeah.
he's like high on his own supply. You know what I mean? So I really want to talk. I really want to touch on, you know, as we're wrapping up here. I just quickly want to touch on, and I
Yeah.
really I found this so charming. and just fascinating about Farmer Maggot. So we already know that Farmer Maggot goes and talks to Tom.
Yeah.
We've been told that in a previous chapter, and
And Tom like knows the history of all their families.
yeah, he knows the history of the families. He knows things about the Shire from days. It says days hardly remembered among the hobbits themselves, and it
Yeah.
says it no longer surprised them. But he made no secret that he owed his recent knowledge largely to Farmer Maggot. And this is the part that I find really interesting. Farmer Maggot, whom he seemed to regard as a person of more importance than they had imagined. And
Yeah.
it says, quote, "There's earth under his old feet and clay on his fingers, wisdom in his bones, and both his eyes are open," said Tom.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that piece, Farmer Maggot, both his eyes are open. He like sees some truth about the world that other hobbits don't, or that maybe most other beings don't.
Yeah.
He doesn't, and maybe he's sort of a kindred spirit with Tom. He doesn't lord it over people. Yeah, he'll sick his dogs on you if you try to steal his mushrooms.
Yeah.
But he sort of sees straight in a way, that other folk don't.
He's got a good head on his shoulders.
That idea of seeing straight, I mean, the fact he's a mushroom grower.
Yeah, I mean, there is something about like mushrooms like growing, like kind of like from the dead things of the earth, and like they grow in the dark. There's an earthiness to Bombadil and an earthiness to Maggot. I think I mentioned in a previous episode that for a time, Tolkien was considering making Farmer Maggot like of the same kin as Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
That he wasn't actually a hobbit, that he just like seemed to be like a hobbit.
This is this is maybe one of those references to the like you and I have talked about this before, not on the podcast, but that Tolkien references his own literary history that never sees the light of day. Well, I mean, it has now, but he references his own kind of process.
Oh, that's a great point. So Tolkien, when he came up with an idea, he really hated cutting it out completely, even if the story changed in such a way that he wasn't able to retain that part of the story. In the Council of Elrond, they say, "Are we sure we can trust the Rohirrim? Like, I've heard that they are like giving horses to Sauron.
Yeah.
That they are like, in league with Sauron. They're paying him fealty." And Aragorn and others basically vouch for the Rohirrim and say like, that was just a terrible rumor. Like we know that they're people of good heart and they would never do this. But in an earlier draft of Lord of the Rings, the Rohirrim had joined the side of Sauron and they were giving him horses. Yeah. He wasn't just stealing them. And so Tolkien's like quoting himself, like he's the one who started the terrible rumor.
Yeah, it's that, and that's the piece. I mean, we're talking about verisimilitude. The reason these kind of things I think jump out at you as you're reading is not just because you're fond of Farmer Maggot, although I am very fond of Farmer Maggot.
Yeah,
it's because in some previous draft there was some description of Farmer Maggot as a being somewhat like Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
And so he retains that, and you can tell that he's retaining something that already got worked on, the same way that, as you said, you can tell that there's, more stories than we could know about Enoch. Right. Yeah. And so anyway, just wanted to touch on that before we get, we already talked a little bit about Show Me the Precious Ring and the way that he, dances and capers with it.
He's able to make it vanish.
Yeah,
he's able to see. He's able to make the ring vanish, which usually the ring makes you vanish. That shows that he's he's very much like in control of the natural world in a way that the hobbits can't begin to understand. And then he's able to see Frodo, who is invisible when he's wearing the ring. He's visible to Bombadil.
And we get a little bit of the sort of ring anxiety that Frodo is kind of progressively advancing into Frodo's soul.
Yeah.
And then he starts to give advice. This is going to take us into the next chapter. Starts to give advice about how to make their way through the downs. Because they decide to go north from his house, which is going to take them over the western and lower slopes of the downs. He says, keep to the green grass. Don't you go a meddling with old stone or cold whites or prying into their houses, unless you be strong folks with hearts that never falter.
Yeah.
And he said this more than once. He repeats it and says, you really need to stay away from these downs and pass them on the west side, not the east side. But yeah, and we get one more song from Tom.
Ho Tom Bombadil, Tom Bombadillo, by water, wood, and hill, by reed and willow, by fire, sun, and moon, hearken now and hear us. Come, Tom Bombadil, for our need is near us.
You sing that and Tom will show up, apparently. I don't know how close you have to be to his house, but...
I was about to say, could they sing this in Mordor and it still work?
That was my question. I'm like, would he show up and be like, I got you guys? You know?
Yeah, he just shows up. No, I think you have to be in Tom's realm.
Yeah.
But as long as you sing the song in Tom's realm, he'll show up and save you.
Which apparently includes the downs. It's not just the forest. It's the whole area there.
I think it's funny that basically all the things he warns them not to do, they do.
Yeah,
a little bit of foreshadowing.
They don't really pay attention, or they are too whatever.
It's not their fault. They're just little guys,
They're
man.
Just little guys, just like us, little guys.
I have a little nephew who's 5 years old now. But I had this moment when I was visiting him last where I had him standing against the windowsill and measured how tall he was. And he was 3'4".
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's like this. That's how little these little guys are.
Yeah. Two of my kids are taller than these guys.
Yeah. And so they're so the fact that they're kind of out there in the world, encountering these forces that are bigger and more powerful than them. I think we can lose sight of that because we're supposed to be seeing this world through Hobbit eyes. But I think if we were watching from afar, these little dudes, encountering all these scary things, I think it is absolutely terrifying. Well, that was a fun read through, man. I don't know. Do you think we did Bombadil justice?
I think we were self-indulgent. Let me put it that way. Well, folks, thanks for reading along with us. Next week, we will be reading Book 1, Chapter 8 of Fellowship, Fog on the Barrow Downs. Of course, you can always help us out by sharing this podcast with a Lord of the Rings fan in your life. Please subscribe, share, follow us on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and don't forget to visit waywardwizards.com for more info.
Until next time, heed no nightly noises. We'll see you next week.